Hello, everyone. I'm David Moore, the CFO for the Tigard-Tualatin School District. Thank you for taking some time out of your day today to listen to our financial update. The update itself should take 25 to 30 minutes. And with that, we'll start with our update. To give everyone an overview of what we will be sharing today, we'll be looking at the district's financial position before the impact of COVID-19. And we'll also talk about the importance of the state economic forecast and the updates that will be upcoming in the next month and onward. These updates related to our revenue forecasts are important. The state relies on those to determine what the revenue estimates are going to be, especially for next year. And we'll also look at some shortfall assumptions if there does happen to be revenue shortfall, which there likely will be, and consider other factors like state reserves and federal revenue, and share the importance of a future special legislative session where the legislature will consider how to respond in the event of a shortfall in 2021. We'll also look at different district shortfall scenarios based on information coming from the state and give an overview of the district's reserve, both currently and historically, and talk a little bit about our timeline and our process for budget development, especially when we're building a budget without having an accurate revenue number from the state. And also give an update on the student investment account and Measure 98 for the upcoming year. And finally, share some cost savings measures, both in the current year and for next year. So before the outbreak of COVID-19, we began to take a look at our financial position for the upcoming year. So I'm going to focus on the slide that you're seeing now. I'm going to focus on the right column of numbers. And as you may know, in the 2019 legislature, the legislature approved a state school fund budget of $9.0 billion statewide. And so for the second year of the biennium, before any impact of COVID-19, the district was expected to receive about $132 million in state school fund revenue. And we had projected a total operating revenue of just over $150 million. And the estimates that we were looking at for expenditures back then were based on current service level staffing and then contractual increases for both personnel and non-personnel contracts. And so that gave us an estimate of total operating expenditures of over $157 million. You'll see we have a deficit there of $7.5 million. So I just want to remind everyone that when the legislature did appropriate that $9 billion, for most districts, including the large districts in Oregon, that wasn't sufficient to maintain current service level on an ongoing basis. We also are showing applying our reserves, our beginning fund balance there, projected at that time at $23 million, and a projecting ending fund balance in 2021 of $15.5 million. You'll see the required reserves per policy are $19.5 million, including the dollars we're setting aside for the opening of the new elementary school in the upcoming years. So overall, we're reflecting in this preliminary estimate a shortfall of $4 million. The state economic forecast. So the economists at the state level have been running models for determining what the impact of a recession is, and we are in a recession. So one one extreme, less extreme, is looking at a similar recession level, similar to the one from 1990. And that was a fairly mild downturn. But in measuring the impact of such a level of recession in today's dollars, that's about a $1 billion shortfall in revenue in a 2-year budget cycle. On the other hand, if we look at the Great Recession resulting from the 2008 financial crisis, that was much more extreme. And measuring that level of recession in today's dollars, that's a loss of $2.7 billion. And then if the recession was to run into future biennia, we could see revenues going down as much as $4.8 billion. The economists also like to look at what's the recovery period, and there's a lot of unknowns right now. They will give their next update, the second quarterly update on May 20th. And there's a couple different illustrations here of what it may look like. The solid red line is the current, reflects the current dip, where things dropped off dramatically when businesses started shutting down and laying off employees. So we're at that bottom right now. And when restrictions, the stay-at-home restrictions are lifted, we'll see an initial uptick or bounce back. And they've coined this as the square root recovery. You'll see a little bit of a square root sign there. Typically, economists look more, in the past, have looked more at a U-shaped versus a V-shaped recovery. Those are the dotted lines. And the determination of that shape of recovery, there's a lot of factors behind that. When does slower growth begin? When the health crisis is brought under control? What has been the permanent damage, and what's the rebound from the pent-up demand from all of us being at home and not spending money like we normally do? And also, what is the outlook for a vaccine discovery to hopefully ward off the threat of the virus in the future? So you can see there's a lot of factors, and this will determine whether we have a shorter term recovery, maybe a year, versus a 2 or 3 year recovery. A state revenue shortfall assumption for the state school fund grant. Currently, the state school fund grant represents about 38% of the state budget. And each $1 billion revenue loss in the state budget would equal a $7.5 million loss to the state school fund grant for Tigard-Tualatin. So keep that in mind as we share information later in the presentation. I mentioned state reserves being an important factor also, and to direct your attention to the far right-hand side of the chart that's on the screen. These are estimates for the end of the biennium for the 3 buckets of reserves at the state level. There's the first one, Educational Stability Fund, $860 million. The Rainy Day Reserve Fund of $962 million. And then the ending fund balance of just over $1.1 billion. So just under $3 billion reserves. These estimates were back in February during the first quarter state economic forecast update. And of course, this was before COVID really hit us. And so these numbers will change, and it'll be interesting to see what they are on May 20th. But there's something to keep an eye on going forward. Federal CARES revenue is also a factor. Initially, we were provided a range of potential positive impact to Tigard-Tualatin from these dollars. Last Friday, we received a more concrete preliminary estimate of $1.4 million, and those dollars will most likely benefit the school district next year, even though they may be allocated at the end of this year. I mentioned earlier the special legislative session to give you a timing idea of that. With the May revenue forecast update, I think the legislature is really waiting for that update on May 20th, because that's going to give them some information how to respond with the state budget. They'll also consider the federal CARES revenue, especially if there's additional dollars through additional packages that come in through that. And the use of that state reserve pot of money, depending on what it is at that point, likely will be less than that $3 billion number, but we'll keep an eye on that to see how the legislature might put those dollars to use, and it could depend also on the outcome of that forecast update recovery time. If the economists are saying it's going to be that longer term recovery, they may want to spread the use of those reserves out over a longer period. And then at that point, likely they'll be convening and considering some of these decisions shortly after that May 20th update. And from the information I just shared, we will likely see an adjustment, a downward adjustment to the state school fund estimate to that $132 million that I shared at the beginning of the presentation. But for sure, the number will be less than that. It just depends on the extent of that downturn. So what does a shortfall at the state level look like for Tigard-Tualatin? We have three ranges of shortfall here: 1, 2, and 3 billion. And first, we start off with considering what was our shortfall even before this impact of the economic downturn. And we mentioned that was $4 million. I mentioned that for every $1 billion revenue loss at the state level means $7.5 million loss to Tigard-Tualatin. So you see $7.5 million at 1 billion, and then another $7.5 billion at 2 billion, and then an additional $7.5 billion at 3 billion. So you see the range there. And then we have the offset for our federal CARES revenue of 1.4 million. So in these worst case scenarios, you're seeing a loss anywhere from 10.2 million to 25.2 million for Tigard-Tualatin. And keep in mind our total preliminary estimate for expenditures that we showed at the beginning was over 157 million. And we'll give further updates as we know additional information, if there's information coming out at the state level, including that legislative special session. District reserves. To remind everyone, the school board has a policy on reserves, so we budget around those policy levels each budget. And there's three primary categories: operating contingency, and that is budgeted at 2% of current operating revenues. So in the current year, $2.8 million. And then ending fund balance, the unappropriated ending fund balance is 5% or 7.2 million. And then the rainy day fund is typically 5% also. What the board did a year ago before they adopted the budget in June was to move 1% of the rainy day fund up to the contingency category. So that reduced the rainy day fund to 4% or 5.7 million. What it did is gave the board and district more flexibility for fluidity in the district budget in the case that additional state funding came forward after we adopted our budget. And in addition, we have a line item under ending fund balance for the opening for the new elementary school. The $1.5 million would help with the new operating costs that would the district would incur with the opening of the new elementary school, including the principal's office, utilities, custodial, and any other costs that we don't have in our current budget that would arise because of the opening of a new building, including teachers that would be added to the budget in the event that the teachers move from other schools were not adequate to meet the needs of the student enrollment. Little more history about district reserves to take us back to the Great Recession beginning in 2008. Due to that financial shortfall during that era, you'll see we ended 2008-09 with $12 million in our ending fund balance. Over 4 years, we drew that down to $3.5 million back in 2012-13. So Tigard-Tualatin back then made a few different decisions in other districts in the surrounding area. We were one of the few districts that didn't have furlough days for staff, so we didn't use that as a cost savings measure. Instead, we relied on reserves. Plus, we did not fill positions that came open due to retirements or other staff leaving the district. So we were able to maintain as much staffing as possible with that methodology, and got to a point where we drew that down to minimal levels, but we made it through that era. And then since then, we've been able to build that number back up. These numbers reflect the budgeted reserves over the past 6 or 7 years. And you'll see that the number has steadily grown. The ending fund balance number has steadily grown over the years. And this will pay dividends in the current year and going forward when we have some tough decisions to make during this economic downturn and revenue shortfall. And the other benefit of this uptick in reserves, it's demonstrated a strong financial position to the district. So when it came time to selling our bonds, we were able to realize additional revenue from those sales that do not result in additional cost to our patrons and taxpayers. So we brought in an additional $51 million because to the $291 million that the voters approved, because the bond investors saw the school district as an attractive investment. And part of it was our due diligence with managing our reserves and building them back up during a bad time of the Great Recession. So our budget development process, we have our first budget committee meeting, our formal budget committee meeting scheduled on May 20th. And this happens to be the same day as that revenue forecast update. But our budget for that day that we will put a proposed budget in front of the budget committee, it'll include a state school fund estimate based on that February 27th estimate. So it's going to be a number that's not reality, but we have the responsibility under local budget law to prepare a reasonable budget based on what we know at the time. So it'll include that state school fund estimate that's not going to be accurate. And it also includes current service level staffing and applying any contractual increase to those staffing, or the staffing, plus contractual increases to non-personnel contracts that we have in place, including our transportation contract. So we'll begin on May 20th by putting a budget in front of the budget committee and using this framework. but likely we'll see adjustments to the budget, maybe even after it's approved and adopted by the Budget Committee and Board, because we'll want to wait for accurate information that's coming out of that special legislative session from the state level as far as what is the real state school fund estimate for 2020-21. And so we'll have to be in parallel with budget development. We'll have to be preparing contingency plans to know how we will react and respond to making pivots to the budget and adjustments to, for sure, making it a smaller budget going into next year. In addition to the general fund resources, including the state school fund, we have the student investment account, which the legislature approved during the 2019 legislative session, plus the Measure 98 dollars. These dollars will also see reductions in 2020-21. For the time being, we'll budget at 100% of funding, but again, we'll have those contingency plans for both. For the SIA, we'll prioritize based on different levels of funding, including 25, 50, and 75%. And for Measure 98, we will plan for reductions in 10% increments up to 30%. And again, once we have more information, we'll have to shift and pivot and adjust the budget accordingly for these two programs. What are some cost savings measures? We're already have a hiring freeze in place for the current year. And as we share this information with district-wide staff, we'll also share information about a spending freeze on discretionary spending. And we're asking department leaders to comb over their budgets and try to determine what are the savings that they'll realize in the current year that we can use as a resource next year. Also, there'll be cost savings considerations for next year, of course. As you see in the pie chart, salaries and benefits represent 85% of our budget. So for sure, there'll be some cost savings considerations related to staffing and personnel decisions. In that smaller slice of 15%, we'll look at discretionary and non-personnel spending. There's less opportunity for savings there due to the smaller dollar amount. And then one thing we're working through right now is a program inventory process with our cabinet and department leaders. And what this involves is evaluating each program that the district currently has and consider student outcomes that we're seeing for each of those programs in addition to the dollar spent on each program. And perhaps is there dollars we can save in making some specific decisions about, or different decisions about specific programs. So this will likely end up with some cost savings in addition to the two other areas in 2020-21. For questions, what we'll be doing is putting out a survey and allow you to frame your questions that way. And with that feedback, we'll develop an FAQ so we can respond to those questions and share out with everyone. So thank you for taking time out of your day to listen to my presentation today, and have a good day. Thank you.